Welcome to online lecture number 4 for Philosophy 1600. The topic for today is fallacy theory. And so we're going to look at a number of fallacies. These are ways basically that arguments can go wrong. And we're going to look at all of these are discussed, by the way, in the posted text by McDonald and Vaughan, although there will be some additional fallacies that I'm going to look at this evening that are not there. All right. So these are just in addition. You can find a lot of websites that talk about these. And I'm going to also either later today or tomorrow post suggested exercises for your labs so that you can get practice with assessing arguments using fallacy theory. And in fact, your next assignment, that's let's see, is that assignment number 3? I guess it's assignment number 3, right? Is it, or whatever it is, or is that assignment 4? I don't know, whatever. But in any case, your next assignment will be on fallacy theory. So I'll post that next this coming Thursday after your labs, and that will be due then in the following week in those labs, and so it goes, right? So the next upcoming assignment then will be on fallacy theory. And so let's get started then. Okay, so first of all, what the heck is fallacy theory? Or what is a fallacy? Let's put it that way. And a very broad definition. Remember, we were talking about definitions. Definitions can be too broad or too narrow. Well, this is a very broad definition. A fallacy is any error in reasoning. All right. So basically, practically any erroneous reasoning will count as a fallacy. All right. And typically in the literature, there are two kinds of fallacies discussed. There are formal fallacies, and when a formal fallacy occurs, there's a structural flaw in the argument, right? And then there are informal fallacies; those pertain to the content of the argument. So we're going to primarily, in today's lecture, focus on fallacies that are informal in nature, but we will talk about a few formal fallacies as well. And actually, I mentioned some of those in the first, I believe it was the first week of lectures when we talked about argument patterns, right? So we already talked about things like affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent. Those are invalid patterns of argumentation. And so we'll talk about those again this evening as well. All right. So first of all, let's, in fact, to start out, why don't we look at a few types of formal fallacies, all right? As I just mentioned, you've already seen two of them, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, right? So remember those two? So affirming the consequent, the valid version of affirming the consequent is, of course, modus ponens, right? Which affirms the antecedent, but affirming the consequent affirms the consequent, right? So it has the following schematic form. If A, then B, B, therefore A, right? So what I'm doing there is I'm affirming the consequent, and what I'm concluding is the antecedent. So an example, Courtney will go to the movie only if she finishes her homework, but Courtney finished her homework, so she will go to the movie. That's an invalid argument that affirms the consequent, okay? Below that is denying the antecedent. And of course, the valid version of denying the antecedent is modus tollens, an argument pattern we discussed in the first lecture, right? So modus ponens, of course, denies the consequence. So it has the form if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. But with denying the antecedent is denied instead. And any version of this is formally invalid, right? So we have if A, then B, not A, therefore not B. That's an invalid argument pattern, all right? So here's an example. Courtney will go to the movie only if she finishes her homework. She didn't go to the movie, so then she didn't finish her homework, right? So clearly that's an invalid argument. That's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent, all right? So both of these arguments are erroneous by virtue of their logical form, by virtue of their structure. As I say here on the next slide, another type of formal fallacy is the exclusive or fallacy. And I think we mentioned this too. Remember, in the first week of lectures, we said that there is a distinction between two kinds of ors, the inclusive or and the exclusive or. So the inclusive or, if I say P inclusive or Q, that means that P or Q or possibly both, right? If I say P exclusive or Q, that means P or Q, but not both. All right. So that's the difference between the inclusive and the exclusive or. So here's an example. Courtney will either go to a movie or she will finish her homework. She went to a movie, so she didn't finish her homework. That would be okay if the or is exclusive, but in this case, the or is inclusive, right? Someone can do both. You can go to a movie and in the same day you can finish your homework, right? So therefore, the two are not mutually exclusive. And so therefore the argument is invalid. All right. So that's called an exclusive or fallacy, and that occurs when the arguer confuses the inclusive or with the exclusive or, right? Another invalid argument form is called illicit predicate instantiation. Here's one version. All S's are P's, X is a P, so X is an S. That corresponds roughly to the fallacy of affirming the consequent, right? So here's an example. All humans are mortal. Socrates is mortal, thus Socrates is human. That argument affirms the consequent, right? Maybe it is true that all humans are mortal. It is, right? And maybe Socrates is mortal, but Socrates could be a cat. It may not be a human, right? So clearly, then the premises can both be true, and the conclusion could still turn out to be false. Recall that that was our definition of what an invalid argument is: an argument where it is possible for the premise to be true, and yet the conclusion can still be false, right? So again, all humans are mortal. Socrates is mortal, thus Socrates is human. Of course, the valid version of that is predicate instantiation, which is all S's are P's, X is an S, X is a P. So all humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Then it would follow logically that Socrates is mortal, right? And just below that is another invalid argument pattern, illicit predicate instantiation 2. It's basically it's just a version or a variation of the first one. It's kind of the analog of modus tollens, right? Or denying the antecedent. So here it is. All S's are P's. X is not an S, so X is not a P. So what if I say all humans are mortal? Socrates isn't human. Socrates could still be mortal if Socrates, for example, is a cat, right? So all humans are mortal. Socrates isn't human. Thus, Socrates isn't mortal is an invalid argument form, right? It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, all right? So just to review, we've seen then several different kinds of which you would call formal fallacies. We saw affirming the consequent, right? If A, then B, B therefore A. We saw the fallacy of denying the antecedent. If A, then B, not A, thus not B. All right. Then we also saw the exclusive or fallacy, and that occurs when the arguer confuses the exclusive use of the word or with the inclusive use, right? And finally, we saw two different versions of illicit predicate instantiation. All S's are P's, X is a P, therefore X is an S. And the other version is all S's are P's, X is not an S, therefore X is not a P. So let's get a little bit of practice. All right, I just have a couple of simple examples, and these arguments involve a formal fallacy, either denying the antecedent or from the consequent, or exclusive or fallacy, or illicit and predicate instantiation, right? So look at the first one. All recessions involve stagflation, that is inflation with no growth, right? So all A's are B's. All recessions involve stagflation. There is currently stagflation, thus we are in a recession. So you can see then that this argument is illicit predicate instantiation, right? All S's are P's, X is a P, so X is an S, right? All recessions involve stagflation. There is stagflation, therefore we are in a recession, right? That is a fallacy of illicit predicate instantiation. It is a formal fallacy. Okay. Now let's look at the argument below that. Only if there is a resolution to the Middle East conflicts will there be worldwide peace. All right. So, in other words, there will be worldwide peace only if there is a resolution to the Mideast conflicts, but there will never be worldwide peace. Right. Okay. And so there will never be a resolution to the Middle East conflicts. So let's just look at that again. There will be worldwide peace only if there is a recession to the Middle East conflicts, right? But there will never be worldwide peace. So that's not A. And so there will never be a resolution. That's not B. So that argument commits the fallacy of illicit predicate instantiation. Okay. All right. sorry, my apologies, not illicit predicate instantiation, but rather it commits the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Okay, the one below that, there will be a civil war in Iraq unless U.S. troops pull out. But U.S. troops are pulling out, and so there will be no civil war in Iraq. So just to let you know, typically logicians at least translate the word unless in natural language as or. So what that argument really says is there will be a civil war in Iraq or U.S. troops will pull out, right? So A or B. But U.S. troops are pulling out. And so there'll be no civil war in Iraq. So notice there that we're construing the or exclusively, when in fact it's inclusive, right? In other words, there could be a civil war in Iraq, but at the same time, troops will pull out. Both could obtain. So even if one happens, the other could still happen. So the problem with that argument is it construes the or as exclusive when in fact it is inclusive. Okay, so just to reiterate, the top argument involves illicit predicate instantiation, right? And the one below that is, again, sorry for the confusion, it is denying the antecedent. And the argument below that we just went over involves the fallacy, the exclusive or fallacy. Okay. So that should give you a pretty good idea as to how these fallacies work, okay, the formal fallacies. And these are the only ones that I'm going to require you to know for the assignment and the midterm test. Now, this is, again, and all of these fallacies, by the way, in this PowerPoint slide are discussed in the McDonald and Vaughan text, all right? So the fallacies that I cover here are the same fallacies that they discuss in the posted textbook, all right? So as I say above here, an informal fallacy, now remember, an informal fallacy involves problems with the content in an argument, not necessarily the formal structure, okay? So an informal fallacy regarding content can occur when, one, the premises are irrelevant to the conclusion. That's the worst kind, by the way, right? To say that a premise is irrelevant to conclusion means that if the premise is true, it has no bearing on the truth or falsity of the conclusion. Or an informal fallacy can occur when the premises lend insufficient support to the conclusion. If you recall last week, we looked at inductive generalizations. In an inductive generalization, the premises lend inconclusive support, or not inconclusive, but rather insufficient support for the conclusion, right? Okay, so those are called fallacies of sufficiency. The first kind are called fallacies of relevance, or finally, a premise can be problematic. Okay, problematic means that the premise could turn out to be false. A premise is problematic if we are not sure whether it is true or false. Okay, so those are the three kinds of informal fallacies that can occur in an argument, right? The premises are irrelevant to the conclusion. That, by the way, is the worst kind. Or the premises lend insufficient support to the conclusion. That's the second worst kind. And the most benign type of informal fallacy is when one or more premises is problematic. And that just means that maybe the premise isn't blatantly false, it just needs more defending, right? Okay. So fallacies, as I say here, relating to the problem of irrelevant premises include the following list of fallacies, right? Okay. By the way, I define it as I just said, a premise P is irrelevant to conclusion C, just in case P's being true has no bearing on C's being true. All right. So let's first of all look at what is called the genetic fallacy. That is a fallacy of irrelevance because basically what happens is instead of looking at the reasoning in the argument itself, you instead focus on the origins of the argument, right? The origins could be a person, it could be an organization, right? And in a way, the genetic fallacy is the most sort of generic kind of fallacy, right? Genetic fallacy. Again, it occurs when instead of critiquing the cogency of the reasons for a claim, the origins or source of the reasons are criticized instead. So here's an example just below. The Chicago Tribune editorial yesterday advocating raising taxes to support social programs. Okay, this is what we'd expect from a liberal newspaper. All right. So the Chicago Tribune is offering the following argument. We should increase taxes. Why? In order to support social programs. So that is basically their argument. But instead of focusing on the argument, the arguer instead focuses on the origins of the argument, which is the Chicago Tribune. So they try to discredit the argument by looking at the origins, right? They say, well, it's a liberal newspaper. So I say there then, in the above example, instead of critically evaluating the reasons offered for the editorial claim, the paper is instead attacked the origins of the claim. Okay, this is a more specific version of genetic fallacy. It just really there's not any difference. It's just that for appeal to the person, or what is sometimes called ad hominem, right? The origin tends to be a person, right, a human being, rather than, for example, a company or an organization. So genetic fallacy includes appeal to the person as a specific version of it. Okay, so it is so anyway. So as I say, it's a species genetic fallacy. So an ad hominem is committed when the person offering the argument is attacked either in terms of personal characteristics, their circumstances, or because of their actions, right? So you're either saying, well, I don't like this person because they have this trait or that trait, or you'll say, I don't like the argument because the person advocating it is in questionable circumstances, or you might say that I don't buy their argument because their actions contradict their reasoning, right? So those are three kinds of ad hominem fallacies, all right? So let's look at the three different kinds of ad hominem fallacies that are discussed in the traditional literature, okay? One is called ad hominem abusive. That occurs when the arguer's character is attacked, all right? So here's an example. I could say Bill Clinton's endorsement of his wife for the Democratic nomination can hardly be taken seriously given his own, quote, ethics, unquote. So let's say that Clinton gives a really good argument for why. Now, this is, back in the 2016 election, when Hillary ran. And you could say, well, he's given a pretty good argument for why we should vote for Hillary. But then you could say, but look at all the scandals he's been involved in, right? So what you're doing is you're taking attention away from the cogency of his argument, and you're focusing the attention instead on his personal character, his own ethics, right? Okay, another version of ad hominem against the person is called ad hominem circumstantial. This occurs when the arguer's circumstances are attacked, right? Example, I could say, well, look, the president of the teachers union is advocating higher wages for teachers, but she herself has much to gain, right? So maybe, for example, let's say they're giving an argument. The head of the union says, look, we need to have higher wages for our teachers because their wages are currently below the rate of inflation, right? Known sometimes as the cost of living. So that might be an argument. But instead of focusing on the argument, the arguer is focusing instead on the individual giving the argument, and in particular, their own personal circumstance. That because the head of the union is also a teacher, they personally stand something to gain by, the argument going through, right? Now, by the way, notice that ad hominem arguments and genetic fallacies are what occur in what you might want to call discussion context, right? Where they used to use the word adversarial, but that has sort of negative connotations. So maybe a more neutral term is to say that ad hominems occur in the context of an argumentative discussion between two or more individuals, right? And what happens is that one person advances an argument and the other person tries to critique the argument, not by looking at the cogency of the argument, but by looking at characteristics of the individual who advanced the argument, like the character, like the circumstances, right? Another way in which another way. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think actually it should be. Yeah, here it is. Sorry, my apologies. So actually, I apologize for that. The slides are kind of mixed up. Slide 8 should actually be slide 7, and slide 7 should be slide 8. So I apologize for that. Okay. Anyway, so this is the third kind of ad hominem is called ad hominem tu quoque. All right. All that means is, now tu quoque in Latin just means you as well, or you too, okay? So an ad hominem tu quoque occurs when someone's claim is criticized because it is inconsistent with their behavior, right? So let's say my dad tells me that I should give up smoking, but my dad smokes, a pack or two a day. Well, it's pretty, I could say, well, Dad, I can't take your argument very seriously because you yourself smoke a pack a day, right? Now, Maybe, my dad has really good arguments for why I shouldn't smoke. Maybe he's citing literature about lung cancer or about cardiovascular disease or whatever it might be, right? Okay. But I ignore his arguments and instead I say, yeah, but you're smoking, so why should I take you seriously? That's called an ad hominem circumstance, or not, or rather, tu quoque, right? Now, in the psychological literature, I don't know if they still use that word now. It used to be called cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance occurs when your actions contradict your beliefs, right? And that's basically what's going on in an ad hominem tu quoque. You're pointing out an inconsistency between what the person says and what they're actually doing. Okay. Now, there's an important caveat that is at the bottom, and we need to talk about that, right? It's important to note. Now, this goes all the way back to Doug Walton in his various books on informal logic, and also it's mentioned in another famous set of books called Logical Self-Defense by Ralph Johnson and Tony Blair. And so Walton, Blair, and Johnson all point out, they're not the only ones. I'm just giving them as examples, right? But they're kind of some of the more mainstream people in informal logic. And so, as they pointed out, the traditional informal fallacies are to some extent contextual, right? In other words, not all instances of a so-called fallacious argument are really erroneous, right? So there might be, for example, some valid versions of ad hominem, right? Some acceptable. And one example that I give here is in legal and political context, right? So for example, I don't know if any of you follow politics, but his name, I think, was in the States, it was Hegseth that was being confirmed in the Senate for a particular position, right? Was it defense or something like that? And but a lot of people said, well, Hegseth has this problem and that problem. That really is what is known as an ad hominem, right? But you might argue. By the way, I'm not taking a political stance myself, so no worries there. But I mean, someone that that is against Hegseth. I believe, by the way, he was nominated. They would say, well, we have to take into account a person's character when we're going to appoint someone to a very important government position because they have the lives of millions of people in their hands, right? Okay, so sometimes in some contexts, the character of the individual is important and should be taken into consideration. Okay, so I'm going to go back to slide 7, which should really be slide 8. Okay, so anyway, so summary then. So we just looked at two fallacies that involve diverting the attention away from the argument and putting it on the origins of the argument. That was the genetic fallacy, and it was ad hominem. There were three versions of ad hominem: circumstantial, tu quoque, and abusive, right? Okay. Now, another important informal fallacy of irrelevance is called equivocation, all right? Equivocation occurs when a term is used in two different senses in the course of an argument. All right. The first philosopher to refer to equivocation, in Western philosophy at least, was the philosopher Aristotle. Right. Aristotle talks about equivocation as a fallacy, both with respect to his formal logic and also with respect to his informal logic. Okay. So again, if I may, equivocation occurs when you use a term in the course of an argument in more than one sense, right? If a crucial term in an argument changes meaning in the course of an argument, that's regarded as an argumentative sleight of hand, right? It makes the argument invalid. All right. So here's an example. This is from Descartes' Meditations, and I hope you don't mind. It is a philosophy course, so I'm going to use a philosophical example. In the Meditations, Descartes argues that God can't be blamed for when I make a mistake in judgment because the faculties God gives me to make judgments are both perfect, right? The faculty of understanding and the faculty of the will. Now, here's what Descartes says. He says the faculty of understanding is perfect in the sense that everything we apprehend with 100% certainty, right? On the other hand, he says the will is perfect in the sense that it is infinite. So notice then that Descartes is equivocating on the word perfect or perfection, right? In one sense, he's using it to refer to being comprehensive, right? And yet there's a second sense where he uses uses the term perfect to refer to infinity, right? And so therefore he is equivocating on the word perfect, all right? So if you haven't yet studied Descartes, but you plan to take another philosophy course to study Descartes, you'll run into this argument let's see, I'm trying to think now what meditation that's in. I believe it's meditation 4, right? So it's in meditation 4 where he talks about that. Okay. All right. So there's argument from ignorance. This is another one. Okay. The argument from ignorance occurs in the following context. I say, okay, so because something hasn't been proven to be true, then it must be false. And the correlative version of that is if something hasn't been proven to be false, then it must be true. And I think if you think about it for a few minutes, you'll see that neither of those arguments are very good arguments, right? Just because something hasn't been proven, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is false, right? There are lots of things out there that haven't yet been proven, but they're definitely true. So, for example, in mathematics, there's something called Fermat's last conjecture. And it was proven a number of years ago by a Princeton mathematician, and now it's called Fermat's last theorem, right? But before that, it was a conjecture because even though mathematicians believed it to be true, no one had proven it. But just because it hadn't been proven, it doesn't follow that it was false. Okay? So that's called the argument from ignorance. And I give you an example here. There is no conclusive proof for God's existence, and so God uh, does not exist. That should be does not exist, right? Or God exists because no one has conclusively disproven God's existence. Those are both versions of the argument from ignorance. Again, it occurs when one, you argue that because something hasn't been proven, it is false, or you argue that because something hasn't been disproven, it therefore must be true. That's called an argument from ignorance. Okay. Now, again, there are notable exceptions to the argument for ignorance. In most cases, it is invalid, but there can be contexts or situations where the argument from ignorance is legitimate. And the best example I can give you is in a court of law, right? So in both Canadian and American legal system, I don't know about other legal systems, basically the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Now that's obviously an argument from ignorance, right? You're assuming that they're innocent unless someone proves them to be guilty. And so that's an argument from ignorance, right? In a legal context, that is a valid, acceptable form of argumentation. So again, you have to be careful. Some of these fallacies, not all of them, but some of them can turn out to be legitimate in certain cases, right? That to some extent, a fallacy charge is context sensitive or context relative. Okay, that's a slide we just went over before. Okay, all right, so is everybody good then? So far we've done ignorance and equivocation, the ad hominem, and the genetic, right? Now we're at red herring. Okay, so red herring occurs when the arguer tries to shift attention away from the issue that's being argued for to a related but a different issue, right? So red herring occurs when the arguer attempts to focus attention away from the issue at hand to an unrelated issue, thereby winning the argument by default. All right. So it's basically some people call it an argumentative sleight of hand. I divert your attention away from the real task at hand, and you get sort of sidetracked, you get diverted, and then and then I end up winning the argument just because you lost touch with the original issue, right? So here's an example. You claim that our company has not done enough to reduce pollution. Okay, so let's say we're at some kind of a meeting and someone is saying, well, your company hasn't really done much to curb pollution. And I could say, okay, fair enough, but what about the other companies that are out there? They're not doing much either, right? And they're not doing much because the government has not given them any guidelines. The current government in general is not very effective. You should focus on government insufficiency. So notice that what the person has done is they've shifted attention away from the issue, which is reducing pollution, and they've shifted it to government inefficiency. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that those are unrelated, but clearly the one is different from the other, right? So when you commit a red herring argument, you're shifting attention away from the main issue at hand. Some people regard straw man as a species of red herring. A straw man occurs when you attribute to someone a view that they don't actually hold. And then by attributing to them a false claim, a claim that they don't hold, the person's attention is diverted away from the actual, from what the person's actual position is. So here's an example. I could say, let's say this occurring in the States. The senator is arguing for universal health care, but that is tantamount to arguing for socialism. Socialism is something we must avoid. So again, it is a red herring, right? Because it's diverting attention away from universal health care to socialism. And clearly, someone might be arguing for universal health care without arguing for socialism, right? So for example, I might be in the US, I might say we need Medicare, right? And even if I'm in favor of Medicare, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm arguing for a socialist position, right? So that is, it's called a straw man, when you attribute to somebody a view that they don't actually hold. A few others. Again, remember, these are fallacies of relevance. So what happens in the fallacy of relevance is you divert attention away from the cogency of the argument and you focus on some other thing, whether it's in a red herring or an equivocation or genetic fallacy or whatever it might be, right? So here is another example. It's called appeal to emotion. Appeal to emotion is sort of a very generic type of fallacy. So the idea is that when you and I are having an argumentative discussion, we should be appealing to each other's sense of reason and not to each other's emotions. We shouldn't be appealing to how we feel about something, okay? So that's really quite important, that in an appeal to emotion, instead of focusing on the argument at hand, you divert attention away from that to emotions, right? And clearly, when you're having an argumentative discussion, you want to try to steer clear of emotions, right? So one type of appeal to emotion is known as the appeal to force. In Latin, it's called ad baculum, right? So that involves trying to persuade someone to accept your claim using an implied threat, right? So I'm sure we've all been through this, right? Your friend, you need to vote for hiring someone in your company, and your boss tells you you'd better hire them or it could affect your own performance evaluation. So what's going on there is that there is an implied threat. That's called an appeal to force and ad baculum, right? Okay. Let's say you have a job, right? And your boss says, you need to do this extra shift this weekend. If you don't, I might have to consider hiring somebody else. So what they're doing there is they're trying to frighten you with a threat, right? They're diverting attention away from from whether why you should do an extra shift on the weekend, and they're diverting it to your fear of getting fired or being disciplined or something like that. So that's called an appeal to force. Another type of emotional appeal is called the appeal to pity, right? In an appeal to pity, you appeal to someone's sense of sympathy for someone else, right? When in fact you should be appealing to some other more, reasons. For example, uh, you should hire me for this job because if you don't, I won't be able to feed my kids. I'm not saying that that's illegitimate. That's a good reason. But the thing is that if you're the head of a company and you want to hire people that are competent, you can't really kind of be diverted by emotion, right? You say, okay, I know, I understand you have to feed your kids, but we've got this really important position and we have to get somebody that's super competent. And unless you're competent, we can't hire you just because you have to feed your kids, right? So that's called an appeal to pity. All right. Now, just as with the appeal to the argument from ignorance, just as with the ad hominem and the genetic fallacy, there are exceptions for appeals to emotions. Sometimes it can be legitimate to appeal to a person's sense of emotion. Okay? For example, I'm sure you've all seen, if any of you watch, television, they have these gut-wrenching advertisements, showing kids starving, or they might have some showing pets being mistreated and starving. And it's just terrible, right? Just plays on your emotions. And as a result, like for example, St. Jude's Hospital, right over in the States there, and they do a lot of good work for sick kids, but it really tugs at your heartstrings, right? And some people would say in that case, it's legitimate to tug on people's heartstrings, right? That sometimes an appeal to pity can be perfectly legitimate in those kinds of cases. All right. So just to let you know again that with all of these fallacies, there is, to some extent, it's a matter of context, right? Okay. A few more. We're almost done. Bear with me, please. Okay, here's a few more. Here's another one. It's called it's called the appeal to popularity, or ad populum. Basically, an appeal to popularity involves appealing to your wanting to belong to a crowd. So I could say, look, everybody else in the company drives a Toyota. You should be like other people in the company, right? In other words, they're appealing to your desire to belong to the community. And so you feel, well, if they're buying a Toyota, then maybe I should too. That's called an appeal to popularity, right? Okay. Um, sometimes you have there's an even worse version. It's called the mob mentality, where people are, like in a mob type situation, will all want to embrace a particular, what's the speaker is saying, just to be part of the crowd, right? So a good example of the mob mentality were Hitler's speeches in the Second World War, right? Appealing to the mob mentality. That's a version of appeal to popularity. And another important fallacy, again, another fallacy of relevance, is called the appeal to tradition, right? Okay. Now, I think you would agree that sometimes tradition is okay. I could say, well, this is the way it's traditionally done, but a lot of times it's better sometimes to break out of tradition, right? So an appeal to tradition involves trying to persuade someone to accept a claim because this is the way it's always been done. So, for example, my parents might say to me, okay, they could say, well, you should vote conservative in the next election because we've always voted conservative and your grandparents voted conservative, right? And I mean, okay, I mean, maybe it is a family tradition, but that doesn't mean that I should vote conservative just because my parents did, right? So the appeal tradition is irrelevant, right? You should give someone a more convincing reason than just that it's the tradition. Now, again, traditions aren't always bad, right? But I'm just saying that there are many cases where a tradition is not that great, and maybe it's better to think outside the box and think of cogent reasons why I should do one thing or the other. There are a couple more, and we're almost done. My apologies. I didn't mean to go on quite this long. Okay. So again, sorry. You have now the two last fallacies I want to discuss under the rubric of fallacies of relevance are the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division, right? The fallacy of composition occurs when you mistakenly assume that what is true of the parts is going to be true of the whole, right? And of course, we know that's not always the case. So let's say, for example, I work on car engines, right? This is the Motor City. A lot of people work on car engines. So I'm working on a car engine on a Saturday, and I've got the engine out of the engine block and that, and I'm looking at each part of the engine. I'm saying, well, the camshaft is in really good shape, and the alternator is in really good shape. Um, and the intake manifold is in pretty good shape. And that might be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the engine as a whole is in shape, right? Maybe the engine wasn't put together well, or there's some kind of design flaw in the engine that transcends the parts being in good working order. So that's called the fallacy of composition. Just because the parts work well, it doesn't mean that the engine as a whole works well. Related to the fallacy of composition, and students often get these confused, so make sure that you know the difference. A fallacy of composition involves going from the parts to the whole, whereas the fallacy of division involves going from the whole to the parts, right? That what is true of the whole is going to be true of the parts. And that's simply not true, right? So I have a simple example down here. The class average was a B. Jen was in that class, so she must have gotten a B. Well, that's not true, right? You're familiar, I'm sure, with the concept of an average, right? Yeah, maybe the average grade was a B. Maybe even the most frequently occurring score was a B. But it doesn't follow that each and every student got a B, right? What is true of the whole may not be true necessarily of all the parts, right? So that's the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division. Again, as I note below, there are sometimes exceptions even for these. For example, if I say the cells making up a carrot are 90% water, then it would follow that the carrot itself is 90% water. Okay, so just a quick reiteration of what we've just discussed in terms of fallacies of relevance. Okay, so we talked about the genetic fallacy that involves appealing to the origins of the argument. A specific version of the genetic fallacy is appeal to the person. You, instead of appealing to the argument, the cogents of the argument, you look at the person who advanced the argument in terms of their circumstances or characteristics or whatever it might be. Another set of fallacies we looked at is a fallacy of equivocation. That occurs in an argument when you use a term in two different senses illegitimately, right? And there's also something called the argument from ignorance. And that occurs when you say that because something hasn't been proven to be true, then it must be false. Or because something hasn't been disproven, it must be true. Okay? So that's the fallacy of ignorance. Again, notice that for a lot of these are exceptions. We also looked at red herring and straw man. Straw man is sort of a specific version of red herring. The red herring occurs when the arguer attempts to focus attention away from the issue at hand to an unrelated issue, right? Okay. The straw man is a similar kind of diversionary tactic where instead of focusing on what the person actually said, you attribute to them a view that they didn't actually hold or advance. That's called a straw man. We also looked at the appeals to emotion. That occurs. So remember that basically when you're having an argumentative discussion with someone, you should be appealing to their sense of reason rather than their sense of emotion, right? So in appeals to emotion, you appeal to their emotions. There are different kinds, like the appeal to force, where you make an implicit threat to try to persuade someone to adopt a particular point of view. The appeal to pity, where you focus on the person's sympathies to try to get them to accept a particular point of view. We also looked at the appeal to popularity. That occurs when you're trying to get someone to believe something, and what you're doing is you're playing on their desire to be part of the crowd. Okay. And then there's something called the appeal to tradition. That occurs when you're trying to persuade someone to accept a claim because that's the way it's always been done. And the last two that we looked at were the fallacies of composition and the fallacies of division. The fallacy of composition occurs when you say that what is true of the parts is true of the whole. And the fallacy of division occurs when you say that what is true of the whole is true of the parts. Okay, so now let's apply this to a few examples. And again, on the assignment, the next assignment that I'm going to post this coming Thursday after your labs, in that assignment, I'm going to give you some mini arguments like these here and ask you to tell me which fallacy of relevance or problematic premise you think is occurring in the passage, right? Okay, so so for practice, let's look through a few of these now, right now. Okay, so I say here for the following short arguments, determine which fallacy of relevance is being committed. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Affirmative action is morally wrong. By the way, why? Affirmative action involves preferential treatment, and preferential treatment involves discriminating between individuals, but discrimination is morally wrong. All right, so this argument, it involves equivocation with respect to the word discriminate. Okay, in the last premise, discrimination is morally wrong. Discrimination means to distinguish between two or more individuals based on prejudice and hate. And that is a morally loaded sense of the word discrimination. But in the other premise, preferential treatment involves discriminating between individuals. The reason for discriminating is not tied up with hate and prejudice. In fact, if anything, you're trying to rectify hate and prejudice. So therefore, the word discrimination in the second last statement means something different than it does in the last statement, and therefore we would say that this argument commits the fallacy of equivocation with respect to the term discrimination. Right? Let's look at number two. President Bush is advocating sending more troops to Iraq. However, Bush himself got out of going to war when he was drafted. So what right does he have to send any troops to war? Okay, so I think if you look at that, you can see that what they're doing is they're focusing on a personal characteristic of a circumstance of Bush. The circumstance is that Bush did not go to war, right? and you're using that to try to discredit his argument. That is, of course, as we saw, the argument of ad hominem abusive against the person, right? Okay. Number 3, you should buy a Ford. After all, you work at Ford Motor Company, and if you're seen driving a Toyota, it could jeopardize your position at the company. I think you would all agree that that's a blatant version of appeal to force. That is an emotional appeal, right? The appeal to force. Let's look at number 4. Scientists have been investigating Mars for years, and they have found no evidence of life, right? So it's safe to conclude that there's no life on Mars. Well, I think it's fair to say that that is an argument from ignorance, right? Scientists have been investigating Mars for years, and they have found no evidence of life. So it's safe to conclude that there's no life on Mars. That is an argument from ignorance. Just because they haven't found evidence of life yet, it doesn't mean that there's no evidence that there is no life on Mars, right? Number 5. So it's an argument from ignorance. Number 5, you're claiming that universal health care is the way to go, but you were ignoring that the money used for that could be used to fund pensions for the elderly. The elderly are clearly not well cared for in our country. So what's going on there is you're shifting focus away from the central issue. The central issue is healthcare, right? And you're focusing it to the elderly. Now, those are related issues, but focusing on the well-being of the elderly is not exactly the same thing as a focus on healthcare, right? So what we've done is we've diverted attention away from the main issue, which is universal healthcare, and now we're focusing on things like pensions for the elderly, right? So this is called a red herring argument. All right. So the other sets of fallacies that McDonald and Vaughan discuss in their book, they kind of merge them together. Some textbooks like Hurley and Copey treat these sets of fallacies separately. These particular authors tend to treat them conjointly, right? They put them in the same category. So you can call them, if you want, problematic premise fallacies or insufficiency, but they put them in the same category. So first of all, let's look at begging the question, all right? Begging the question occurs when the premise that you use to support your conclusion is virtually a restatement of the conclusion. So the form of the argument is P, premise, therefore P, right? So it's called a circular argument. Remember when we were looking at the theory of definitions? A circular argument occurs when the term to be defined is in the definition. And this can also occur in an argumentative context. A fallacy of begging the question occurs when a premise is that is used as a reason for the conclusion is similar or identical to the conclusion itself, right? Now, by the way, don't confuse begging the question here with the way it's often used, right, in ordinary language. So a lot of times people will say, well, the fact that the railroad system in Windsor is in disrepair begs the question of whether or not we should increase taxes to fund improvements in the railroad. Notice there that begs the question doesn't mean the same thing that it does in logic. It means begs the question there means points to the further issue of, right? But beg the question in this case doesn't mean that. It means assuming what you're trying to prove, all right? Here's some simple examples of begging the question. There's a providential order to the universe, and hence God exists, okay? So the word providential means the same thing as godly. There's a godly order to the universe, and hence God exists, all right? So that begs the question, P, therefore P. There's also something in St. Thomas Aquinas called the ontological proof. And it goes like this. God's essence is existence, therefore God exists, okay? Does everybody see that the premise and the conclusion are one and the same thing? That the premise is really just a restatement of the conclusion, right? God's essence is to exist, therefore God exists. In other words, God exists, therefore God exists. That's called begging the question, when the premise is basically a restatement of the conclusion, okay? You're assuming, in begging the question, you're assuming what you're trying to prove. Another problematic fallacy or insufficiency fallacy is known as false dilemma. A false dilemma occurs usually false dilemma arguments are valid. They're what are called, well, we called them, we used that name a while ago, disjunctive syllogisms, right? If I say A or B, not A, therefore B, that of course is a valid argument. The problem is that, again, remember that with informal fallacies, the problem isn't with the structure of the argument, the problem is with the content. So I may have a perfectly legitimate disjunctive syllogism that still commits the fallacy of false dilemma. And that happens when you say A or B, but you ignore a third option. All right. So I could say, for example, George Bush has said that either you're with us or you're against us. Right. Well, the thing is that what if the country is neutral? Right? Think of Switzerland, for example. Until at least recently, used to be regarded, I think now it's in NATO, but until recently was regarded as a neutral country, right? So basically, there's a third option that this argument ignores. Bush has said that you're either with us or you're against us. Okay, well, okay, what about you're neither with you or against you, right? So Bush did, in fact, make that fallacy in reasoning when he was president, right? So the implied additional premise then and conclusion for countries not with them are that you're not with us, so you're against us, right? The third option ignored by Bush is a country that is neutral, okay? So that again is a false dilemma. A false dilemma occurs in a disjunctive syllogism type of argument when you ignore a third option. You say A or B, not A, therefore B, but you ignore a third option. Maybe it's A or B or C, right? Okay, so that is called a false dilemma. This is another very famous informal fallacy. It's called slippery slope. All right. A slippery slope occurs when you say A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and so on and so forth, right? So a fallacious slippery slope occurs when you use premises, or sorry, when you use factors that are causally related to one another, but there might be a defect in some of the causal claims, right? So a fallacious slippery slope has the following form. Premise, A leads to B, premise, B leads to C, premise, C leads to D, premise, we don't want D, therefore we don't want A. Okay, so you can see there that it's a reasonable sounding argument. The problem is that one or more of those premises may actually need further defense. It's a problematic premise. Maybe it is true that A leads to B, but maybe it's not true that B leads to C. So, for example, I have a simple example down below. We can't allow tapping of phones of suspected terrorists. If we do, then soon the government will be tapping phones of relatives of terrorists. And if they do that, they will start tapping the phones of innocent citizens. But if that happens, freedom will be restricted. That's unacceptable. Therefore, we should not allow tapping of phones of suspected terrorists. Okay, so as you can see there, that's a slippery slope. It may be true, it may well be true that if we allow tapping phones of suspected terrorists, the government could end up tapping phones of relatives, all right? But from that, we can't say that if they do that, they're going to stop tapping everyone's phone. That doesn't make any sense, right? So in other words, some of the causal claims are okay, but some of them are questionable. And so we say then that this argument commits a fallacious slippery slope. Okay? All right. Couple more. Hasty generalization, sometimes known traditionally as converse action. That occurs when there is insufficient evidence offered in support of a claim. Either the sample is too small or it's not representative, right? So hasty generalizations are thus very weak inductive arguments. And we saw that last week when we were looking at inductive generalizations, right? We remember we talked about margins of error and you know, the fact you know, and what confidence levels and things like that, and that you have to take those into account when you're making a statistical generalization, right? So here's an example of a hasty generalization or converse axiom, right? Uh, 245 of 300 chemistry students interviewed at the university said they will vote Democratic in the next election. Thus, most students at the university will vote Democrat in the next election. Okay. Well, here's the problem, right? Um, you know, does that, you know, notice that it's talking about chemistry students, but then we're generalizing to all students. So I think you would agree then the sample is not representative. Remember, we talked about that last week as well, that samples in statistical generalizations need to be representative. They need to be randomly selected, right? And they need to cohere with a margin of error at a certain confidence level. And the problem with this argument is that the conclusion goes beyond the evidence. The evidence is that, you know, a lot of chemistry students say they will vote Democrat, but it doesn't mean that students in general will vote Democrat, right? So the conclusion goes beyond the evidence. That's called a hasty generalization or a converse accident. Okay. All right. Here's another fallacy: faulty analogy. That occurs, it's a weak inductive argument where two things are alike in one respect, but they're not alike in another. Well, really, in a way, we already talked about that last week. Remember, I gave you some criteria for evaluating analogies, right? So you can use those criteria. So, for example, here this is an example that we used last week. Like a programmed computer, the human mind stores memories. Since a computer has total recall, it follows that humans have total recall. Well, I think you would agree that that's a bad analogy, right? Yes, it may be true that, like computers, the human mind stores memories, right? But the human mind does not have total recall, right? So A is like B in respect of X, and B has the additional character of Y, but it doesn't follow that A necessarily has Y, right? So that's a faulty analogy. And again, you have those four criteria for evaluating analogies that I gave you last week. Okay, a little bit of practice. Oh, by the way, we should maybe before we go to this, we should just review what we've just talked about. Okay, so there aren't as many fallacies relating to problematic premises, just a handful, right? Not as many as the fallacies of relevance. So again, just to reiterate, there's the fallacy of begging the question. That occurs when the premise is a restatement of the conclusion, right? In other words, begging the question occurs when you assume what you're trying to prove. False dilemma, okay? That occurs when an argument is structurally sound, but you know, it's a disjunctive argument, like a disjunctive syllogism, but there's more than two options, right? So in a false dilemma, I say, well, either A or B, right? But I ignore a third option, C. Okay. So for example, let's say you could say to me, well, you know, either you know, I should give to charity, you know, either I should give, either I should give 10% or I shouldn't give anything. All right. If I can't give 10%, I shouldn't give anything. Well, obviously, that's a false dilemma. Maybe I could afford to give 5% or 3%, right? So, what I'm doing there is I'm ignoring that there are other options. We also looked at slippery slope. A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, right? That isn't always necessarily the case. One or more of the causal chains may be defective, right? It may be the case that A doesn't lead to B or that B doesn't lead to C or whatever, right? There may be a defect in the causal chain, right? So that's called a slippery slope. And a couple more. Hasty, actually, these are ones that we covered in more depth last week, right? Hasty generalization again, or converse action occurs when there's insufficient evidence offered in support of the claim. Maybe the sample is not representative, or you know, again, going back to margin of error, confidence level. Maybe the conclusion goes beyond what is entailed by the margin of error, that kind of stuff, right? Faulty analogy. Again, we looked last week criteria for evaluating analogies, right? And remember that analogies have the form A is like B in respect to property X. B also has property Y. All things that have X tend to have Y. Therefore, A also has property Y, right? So we already learned all that stuff last week when we talked about statistical generalizations or inductive generalizations and analogies. Okay, so practice makes perfect. And so let's go through some examples, all right? For the following arguments, indicate which fallacy of problematic premise or insufficiency each commits. So here's number one, okay? People are always saying that Jaguars are expensive to fix, but two of my friends have Jaguars and the repairs have been inexpensive. Thus, I'm going to consider buying a Jag, right? So the argument is, a lot of people say, well, Jags are very expensive to fix, but I have two friends, they have Jaguars, and it has not been expensive to fit their Jaguars, okay? All right, that's not a terrible argument, but the thing is, two people is a pretty small sample, isn't it? So I think you would agree that that is a faulty generalization. It's a converse accident. It's a hasty generalization, right? Two Jaguars is not a good enough sample size to make the inference that Jaguars are reliable or easy to fix. Okay, here's number two. We can't let Agnes off with a warning on her traffic infraction. If we do, then police will start letting everyone off with a warning. If that happens, people will begin driving carelessly. So I think you'd agree there that that's a series of causal inferences, right? A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D. That is clearly a slippery slope, right? It says we can't let her off with a warning because if we do, then everyone will start letting everyone off with a warning, and if we do that, people will begin driving carelessly. Well, that certainly the claim that if we let this one person off for a warning, it doesn't follow that we're going to start letting everyone off with a warning, right? Maybe in this particular case, it was warranted for one reason or the other. Okay. It's a slippery slope fallacy. Number three, organs are like part of a car. When they are defective, simply replace them, and the person will be as good as new. All right. I think you would agree with me that that is a faulty analogy, right? Okay. Um, yes, it may be true that in some respects organs are like parts of a car, right? They fit together as a whole to make the human body function as a whole. When they're defective, we can get transplants, but it doesn't necessarily mean the person is as good as new because there's immune rejection, right? So it's a faulty analogy. Number four, freedom is important to human beings. And so it follows that people hold freedom in high regard. So I think you would agree there that the premise and the conclusion are the same thing, right? P, therefore free. It says P, therefore P. It says freedom is important to human beings. That's the premise. And the conclusion is freedom, people hold freedom in high regard. Well, that's the same thing as the premise, right? So that argument begs the question. Finally, well, this is the example I just gave you. Number five, I'll give 10% of my income to charity or I'll give nothing. I'm not prepared to give up 10% of my income. Things are tight, so I won't give anything to charity. As we mentioned a few seconds ago, that is a very blatant example of false dilemma, right? There's more than one option. I could give 5%, I could give 3%. So clearly that is a false dilemma, right? So what we've done then is we've looked at a number of fallacies, informal fallacies, and a couple of formal fallacies at the very beginning. And those are all discussed in McDonald and Vaughan. And I'm going to assign you for the labs some suggested exercises. And there's a whole bunch of them in Vaughan, right? So you'll find a lot of exercise in Vaughan about that. And I'll see if I can find some additional ones. Okay. So anyway, that's PowerPoint number one. Okay, so let me just switch slides here. I'll only be a second. Let's see, that was fallacy theory one, so I need fallacy theory two. And let's see, okay, we're good. Okay, there it is. All right, great. Okay, so this is, there's a second PowerPoint I want to go over, and then we'll be done for the lecture for the evening, right? So look, recall from last time, well, 5 minutes ago, right? We looked at a number of formal fallacies, including affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, and illicit predicate instantiation, right? Remember that, right? So from the consequent, if A, then B, B, therefore A, denying the antecedent, if A, then B, not A, therefore not B, list predicate instantiation, all A's are, all A's are B's, X is a B, therefore X is an A. Okay, so in addition, we looked at two sorts of informal fallacies that are covered in the Vaughan text, right? We looked at fallacies of relevance, and we looked at fallacies of problematic premise, right? So fallacies of relevance include the genetic fallacy, ad hominem, equivocation, ignorance, red herring, straw man, emotion, which includes both pity and force, popularity, tradition, composition, and division. All right. Fallacies of problematic premises and sufficiency include begging the question, false dilemma, slippery slope, hasty generalization, and faulty analogy. So that's what we just went over in the previous PowerPoint. Okay. Practice makes perfect. I have a bunch of exercise here, so why not, man? Might as well work through them, okay? So for the following arguments, determine which fallacies of irrelevance or problematic premises the argument commits. Number one, all physical objects carry a slight physical charge, given that all atoms and molecules carry a slight physical charge, okay? So I've taken a lot of chemistry. That is true, actually. I mean, it is true that molecules and atoms all carry a slight charge, right? Okay, but it doesn't follow that the objects of which they're composed will have a physical charge, all right? So here's the deal. This argument commits the fallacy of composition, that what is true of the parts may not be true of the whole, okay? Number two, the candidate is always preaching about justice, even though their career is replete with scandals. On these grounds, we can take what they say with a grain of salt, right? Okay, would you not agree that we're appealing to the origins of the argument, and so that would be an ad hominem, right? I suppose you could call this maybe an ad hominem tu quoque, maybe an ad hominem circumstantial. I'm not really that concerned. Just as long as you say ad hominem, you'll get full marks, okay? You don't have to necessarily have the species of ad hominem. Just say ad hominem, right? Or if you want, appeal to the person. Number three, all of the engineers at the firm are highly competent. So you have absolutely nothing to fear regarding the competence of the firm itself. Well, again, you might have a lot of really good workers, but that doesn't mean that the firm itself is good, right? If it's not well managed, or if the workers don't get along together well, they don't work together well, then even though each of them are competent, the firm as a whole may be incompetent. And I think you would agree that that again is a fallacy of, of composition, right? That what is true of the whole, or sorry, what is true of the parts may not necessarily be true of the whole. Number four, nothing indicates that John misused funds when he was CEO. So I can only assume he was a good CEO. Does everybody see what that one is? So again, I have no reason to believe that John misused funds when he was the head of the organization, right? Then it follows that he must have been a good CEO. The problem is that even if I have no proof that he misused funds, it doesn't necessarily follow that he didn't, right? So even though I have no evidence that he wasn't a good CEO, it doesn't necessarily follow that he was. And so that is an argument from ignorance. Number five, Angie is always taking the holier than thou stance when it comes to drinking on campus. She is saying that drinking is immoral, but she has no right to force her opinions on others. Okay. Well, here's the problem. Even if this particular person doesn't like the idea of drinking on campus, I used to teach in the States, and you're not really supposed to drink on campus because the drinking age, I think, is 21, right? So most students can't drink, so there's no drinking on campus. And so, but that doesn't mean that a person is saying drinking is immoral. I could say, well, there shouldn't be drinking on campus because most of the students are under the age of 21, right? And that's a reasonable argument. Okay, I'm not making a moral claim. I'm simply making a legal claim. All right. So therefore, what is happening in number five is it is known as a straw man, right? And she is not saying that drinking is immoral. She's only saying that it should not be allowed on campus. Okay. Number 6, if you don't study night and day, then you can't have a social life. If you have a social life, you can't study night and day. So you have to make a choice. Anytime you see the word choice, right, you're looking at a false dilemma. Number 7, the union is always claiming that the company pays low wages, yet the union pays very low wages to its own workers. In fact, the union does a lot of things it charges the company with doing. We need a more effective union to represent our workers. Okay, so basically, I think you would agree that that is maybe what? Not exactly an ad hominem, it's a genetic fallacy that we're trying to discredit what the union is saying, right? By discrediting the company itself instead of looking at the cogency of their argument. So that is a genetic fallacy. Okay. All right. So far, so good. All right. So we've had plenty of practice now. We've gone through quite a few examples where we've been applying the various fallacies discussed in McDonald and Vaughan. Now, as I say here, let's look at some additional fallacies. These fallacies are not in McDonald and Vaughan, but you'll see them in a lot of logic books. It's in Hurley, it's in Copey. These fallacies are discussed in a lot of books on logic and critical thinking. Okay, so let's look at some of them. Okay. Frankly, I'm not really going to worry about these, okay? Because we didn't really focus on on that much on formal fallacies. So I'm not going to let's just forget about this one, okay? So I'm going to pass over this one. Okay, these are the ones that I want to focus on, okay? Informal fallacies. So again, FYI, you are not responsible for slide number 4 in the second PowerPoint presentation for this evening, okay? Anyway, yeah, I should have excluded that slide because I didn't plan on covering it. Okay, so now here are some additional informal fallacies, and this is to adumbrate the list of fallacies that we already have. Okay, first of all, an important fallacy is called the fallacy of accident. A fallacy of accident occurs when you say of something that is generally true that it is universally true. So as I say here, then, an accident fallacy involves making a faulty inference based on a confusion between something's being generally true with its being universally true. Here's an example. Everyone has the right to free speech. Thus, hate groups have a right to spread their literature. Okay. Again, the problem with this argument is that, yes, it may be true that people have a right to free speech. It's a general right, but it's not a universal right. Okay. So this argument then involves confusing universal with general. Number 2, known as false cause. A false cause, and I know it's kind of a circular definition, involves making faulty causal inferences. And there are 3 kinds of false causes. Fancy Latin names, I hope you don't mind. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Okay. Post hoc means after this, ergo propter hoc, therefore, because of this. Okay. After this, therefore, because of this. It involves inferring that A caused B on the basis of A's preceding B in time. All right. So think about it. People make those kinds of causal inferences all the time. So I could say all 4 of us ate at the restaurant last night, and the next day we all became ill. Thus, it's something that we ate at the restaurant. Well, maybe, or maybe we just all had the flu and we didn't start to get symptoms until today. So it may have no relationship to what we ate at the restaurant last night, right? So just because A precedes B temporally, it doesn't necessarily follow that A is the cause of B. Okay, here's another false cause fallacy. It's called oversimplification. It occurs when you focus on one causal factor and you ignore a whole bunch of others. So here's an example. I could say, well, my son would study harder if only he understood the need of education. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe there are other reasons why he doesn't study hard. Maybe he's got a couple part-time jobs, right? Or whatever it might be, right? And so, it may, although maybe, maybe if he understood the need for higher education, it would help, but it may not be the only determinant factor. So that's called the fallacy of oversimplification. Okay. What people sometimes do too is they confuse cause with effect. I mean, it's not a great example, but the most productive employees at our firm are paid the highest wages. Thus, high wages cause productivity. So I could say, look, you look at our company, the best workers at our company are the ones that get the highest wages. But the problem is that the wages may not cause the competence of the employees. Rather, the competence of the employees is what causes them to get high wages. So what you're doing there is you're confusing cause with effect. The same kind of argument occurs in ethics. I also teach a lot of ethics. So, for example, in what sometimes happens in ethics, it's called the let me think now. It's called the theory of psychological egoism. The theory of psychological egoism says that we are only capable of acting selfishly. We never act altruistically. And one argument given for psychological egoism is what is known as hedonistic psychological egoism. It's the view that every time I do something nice for someone else, it gives me pleasure. So let's say I volunteer in a soup kitchen, right? And it gives me pleasure. Then some people might infer that the pleasure is what causes me to do the volunteer work. But what should be noticed is that the pleasure is an effect of the volunteer work. It doesn't cause the volunteer work, it's an effect. So sometimes people have a tendency to confuse cause with effect. Okay. All right. So far, so good. So those are the three different versions of false cause. One is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because of this, or after this, therefore, because of this, oversimplification. You try to narrow everything down to just one causal factor. Confusing cause with effect, right? The example I just mentioned from ethics. Okay, now there another fallacy, additional fallacy, is called complex question. It's a presumptive fallacy, kind of like begging the question. A question is asked such that no matter how it is answered, the arguer's claim is verified. Example, suppose I'm a police officer and I arrest someone, and I say, were you running when you stole the purse? And the suspect says, well, I can't run. I have bad legs. So then I say, then you were walking when you stole the purse. Does everybody see the fallacy in that reasoning, right? The officer is asking two questions in one and not distinguishing the one question from the other. And therefore, the suspect, no matter what they answer, they're granting the police officer the claim that the suspect is guilty. Okay. So I don't know if any of you, if you drive, I know this happened to me. I'll be driving and the police officer pulls me over and they'll say, did you know how fast you were going? Right. So no matter what I say, if I say, no, I don't, I'm still going to get charged with speeding. And if I say I do, I'm still going to get charged with speeding, right? So that's called a complex question. It's a presumptive fallacy, kind of like begging the question. No matter how you answer it, you're done, right? That's called a complex question. This is an important additional fallacy. It's called the fallacy of suppressed evidence. This occurs when the arguer reaches a conclusion by only considering some of the available evidence, right? And let's face it, I mean, sometimes that can happen, right? Where sorry about that. My mouse fell on the floor. I hope that's not on the screen there. My apologies if it is. Anyway, yeah. So suppressed evidence occurs when the arguer reaches a conclusion by only considering some of the available evidence, right, and ignoring the rest. And that happens. I mean, we're only human, right? Sometimes we tend to suppress evidence that goes against what we're arguing for, and we tend to mainly consider evidence that that will help support what we're trying to argue for. So here's a simple example. Teachers make more money than they did 10 years ago. Well, I guess that's true. For example, lecturers and professors and sessional instructors at the university generally make more than they did 10 years ago, right? And that's basically true. Thus, they have no right to complain about their wages. Now, does everybody agree that that doesn't follow? Because they're suppressing evidence. For example, teachers make more money than they did 10 years ago. That might be true, but it doesn't follow that their wage increase keeps up with inflation. So, for example, as you probably know, in Ontario, both teachers and college instructors, right? So basically, university faculty and college instructors were limited to 1% increase per year. So over the 3 or 4 years, we all got a 1% increase. So it's true to say then that I made, let's say, 4% more than I did 3 or 4 years ago, except that that doesn't keep up with the pace of inflation, right? So, so therefore, yeah, it might be true that they made more money than they used to, but it still doesn't mean that they're doing okay. This is an interesting one. It's called subjectivism, and a version of it is called wishful thinking. What happens in subjectivism is that I kind of think, well, because I believe it must be true, it must be true, right? So I could say something is simply true on the grounds that I believe it to be true. Well, I mean, I mean, that's human nature, right? Sometimes we like to assume that what we believe really is true. But of course, that's not true, right? So for example, if I say, I believe in my heart that euthanasia is morally wrong. So this particular person should have been jailed. Well, just because I believe it in my heart doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, right? You can believe something in your heart and it may still not be true. So that's called subjectivism, that it involves inferring that something is true simply on the grounds that you believe it to be true. And it doesn't always, doesn't always work that way, right? Um, Another version of subjectivism is called wishful thinking, right? That occurs when the arguer infers that something is true simply because they want it to be true. I know about you, but every time I buy a lottery ticket, I I think, yeah, this is going to be the one that wins, right? Why? Because I want to win. Okay. And that, that's okay. I mean, we're only human, right? But the thing is that wishful thinking doesn't mean that it's true just because we want it to be true, right? So, example, I could say the company that I work for couldn't possibly fold because I have so many bills to pay. I know it will be okay. I'm not worried. Everybody argues that way, right? But the problem is that just because you want it to be the case that the company won't fold, it doesn't mean that it won't, right? Even if it's too hard to entertain it's being true, sometimes it is true, right? So the company might fold anyway, even if you don't want it to fold. This is one I'm sure you've all heard of. It's called the fallacy of two wrongs, right? I'm sure you've all heard the expression, two wrongs don't necessarily make a right, okay? Two wrongs is the argument that a morally or prudentially wrong act is justified on the grounds that it will right a previous wrong, okay? And that isn't always the case. In fact, it often isn't the case. So you've heard that. So as I just said, you've heard the truism, two wrongs don't make a right. Example, I could say the death penalty is morally justified for murder because the convicted murderer showed no regard for the life of their victim. Okay. Now, again, I'm not making any political claims. I'm just using this as an example, right? But for example, some people that are in favor of the death penalty, I have heard some people give this argument. All right. Well, okay, that's fine. The only problem from a kind of a critical thinking point of view is that two wrongs don't always make a right. Just because the murderer did not treat their victim well, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat the murderer with some kind of dignity or respect, right? So that's what some people might argue. So it's two wrongs don't always make a right, or I could say, well, I mean, I'm gonna, I got into an accident and I had a little fender bender. I'm gonna get and you know what? By the way, there's a scratch on the side of my car that's been there for a couple months. I'll get the insurance company to pay for that as well, right? And I'll say, well, what the heck? I mean, they make a lot of money. They overcharge, Yeah, well, I'm sorry, but two wrongs don't make a right. Just because they overcharge doesn't mean that I should overcharge, right? Fair enough? Okay. So that's two wrongs don't make a right. This one is a really bad one. It's called the fallacy of inconsistency. All right. Basically, two statements are inconsistent if they can't both be jointly true. So I could say it is and it is not raining. They can't both be jointly true, right? It's one or the other. So inconsistency occurs when the arguer contradicts themselves in the course of an argument. That is, two of their premises go against each other. The two premises that they argue can't both be true at the same time. Here's an example, all right? While it is important to adhere to the letter of the law, by the way, this is not my example. I got this from a critical thinking text a long time ago. While it is important to adhere to the letter of the law, an exception should be made in this case because the defendant has already paid a heavy price in terms of lawyers' fees and endless trials. They should be exempt from mandatory sentencing. Okay, and I've heard people make that argument. Maybe that's, maybe it's not such a bad argument. I've heard worse arguments, right? But there is an inconsistency there. Because what they're saying is that it's important to adhere to the letter of the law. Yet they're saying that in this particular case, we should not adhere to the letter of the law. Both of those can't be true at the same time. So this arguer is committing what is called the fallacy of inconsistency. Okay. Okay, this is a good one. If you want the fancy Latin name, it's called non sequitur, right? A non sequitur occurs when you have a really good reason for something, but then you draw the wrong conclusion. Okay, so as I say here, an irrelevant conclusion or non sequitur occurs when a premise that is relevant to one particular conclusion is instead used to support a conclusion to which it is not strictly relevant. So here's an example. The schools in our district are seriously underfunded. They don't have the money to buy computers and books, which means the quality of education is suffering. It follows that we need to increase taxes as soon as possible. Well, in a way, that's not the worst argument I've heard in the world. The problem is with the conclusion, right? The premises are good, they're strong, but they don't support the conclusion, right? In other words, what they do support is a claim that we need to give more support to our schools. But it doesn't mean that we have to increase taxes to do that, right? Fair enough? Okay. So the statement that we need to increase taxes is called a non sequitur. It does not follow, strictly speaking, from the premise. All that follows from the premises is that we need to give more funding for schools. But of course, taxation is not the only way to increase funding for schools. Okay. Okay. So let me just review these with you for a few minutes. We talked about a number of additional fallacies. Again, I said ignore slide 4. Okay, so slide 4, pretend slide 4 doesn't exist. Okay, so now we're on slide 5. All right, so we looked at a bunch of additional informal fallacies. One was called accident. It involves a claim that something that is generally true is universally true, and that's not always the case. Sorry about that. False cause. Different kinds, right? One is called post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because this happened after it, then, in other words, because this happened before that event, then what happened before must have been the cause, and that doesn't always follow. Oversimplification, you focus on one causal factor, there might be a lot. Confusing cause with effect, right? I gave you the psychological egoism example. Every time I perform an altruistic act, I get pleasure. Well, the pleasure is the effect of the act, but it's not necessarily the cause. Complex question occurs. It's a presumptive fallacy, kind of like begging the question, where no matter how the person answers the question, they're going to prove the arguer's position. In other words, the arguer couches two questions in one. And so they don't tell the person that they're actually asking two questions, right? So it's called a complex question. Another one that we looked at is suppressed evidence. Very common, sometimes we don't say everything. So let's say I'm writing a scientific paper, okay? I published a bit in Science, and I'm writing a scientific paper. You really have to cite all the evidence, right? So I might say, well, I have this particular hypothesis. I've written papers where, I have a lot of evidence, but then I have to, if I'm, you're not a good scientist if you don't. I have to say, well, although this evidence seems to support my hypothesis, here are some counter instances, right? And a good scientist, a good arguer always points not just to the evidence that they prefer, but to all the evidence, right? So that's called suppressed evidence. Subjectivism. I want it to be true, therefore it is true. That doesn't follow. Wishful thinking. It's got to be true. It has to be. No, not necessarily, right? Two wrongs. We all know two wrongs don't make a right, okay? I file a false insurance claim. And why justify it? Because, well, the insurance overcharges. That's two wrongs don't make a right. That's just not the way life works. Okay. Inconsistency, a really bad one. It happens when you contradict yourself in the course of an argument. All right. And the last one we looked at was non sequitur, irrelevant conclusion. It occurs when a premise that is relevant to a particular conclusion instead uses to support a conclusion to which it is not strictly relevant. Okay. All right, so a few more examples, and then we're going to call it a day. Which of the fallacies mentioned above, irrelevant conclusion, right? complex question, suppressed evidence, false cause, two wrongs, et cetera, right? So if all of the ones we just looked at, which of the fallacies that we just talked about are the following mini arguments committing? Okay. By the way, ignore, again, it's ignore one because that's a formal fallacy. Okay. Here's number two. Whenever I think of a close friend, I usually run into them. Right. I know about you, but that happens to me a lot. I'll be thinking about a friend and all of a sudden there they are. Right. Happens all the time. Obviously, there's something to be said for the power of thinking. Now, what is being assumed there is that my thinking about my friend caused him to be there, right? And of course, there's no obvious causal connection. In fact, what that is a false cause. In fact, it is a post hoc ergo propter hoc. Just because I thought about my friend and then they appeared, it doesn't mean that my thinking about them caused them to appear. So that's a false cause fallacy. Number three, I know my friend is innocent. Their guilt would simply be too horrible to contemplate. They just couldn't have done it. I think you'd agree that that is a, you could either, I would take either subjectivism for that or wishful thinking, right? Number four, there is a serious deficit in pension funds. This needs to be rectified so our elderly can get the care that they deserve. Thus, we need to cut military spending. Okay. Does everybody see there that the premises don't lend really any direct support to the conclusion? It's an irrelevant conclusion, right? Just because we need to increase pensions for the elderly, it doesn't necessarily follow that we're going to achieve that by cutting military spending. All right. So that's an irrelevant conclusion. It's a non sequitur. Okay. I'm kind of a history buff. Ben Franklin, right? Great thinker in American history, philosopher, scientist, politician. Ben Franklin said that a stitch in time saves nine. Okay. What the heck does that mean? Well, what it means is that, let's say I have a tear in my sweater or my shirt, right? If I stitch it up now, then it won't get any worse and I can keep the shirt maybe for a couple more months longer, right? A stitch in time saves nine. So therefore, I will get my oil changed every 1,000 miles to avoid engine trouble. I actually do know car nuts that get their oils changed even every 1,000 kilometers, whatever, 1,000 miles. Okay, well, it is true in general that a stitch in time saves nine, that preventative measures will sometimes head things off of the pass. But in the case of changing oil in a car, if you change it every 1,000 kilometers, it's not really going to help your engine, right? That's a case where, generally speaking, preventative measures work, but in this particular case, they don't, right? Again, the fallacy of accident, that what is true generally may not be true universally. Okay. Number six, I can't stand people who say one thing and who do another. By the way, don't do as I say, do as I do. Well, I know it's kind of a blatant, it's inconsistency, right? Okay. Number seven, there was a draft in the house. I don't know if this happened to you. This happens to me all the time. For example, I'll give you an example. In my porch, in my back room, where my dog sleeps, right? Sometimes when it rains, there's a leak. And I don't understand because I had the roof fixed a couple years ago. So I keep trying to find the causes, and I'll say, oh, well, there's a little leak there, and so I patch it up, and then it leaks again, and then I patch it up, and it still leaks. That's called, that's called a oversimplification, right? There was a draft in the house. I found a small crack in the ceiling, so I repaired it. That should take care of the problem. No, it doesn't, right? Just like my porch, I'll patch it up. I've already patched it up a couple times, and it still leaks. Okay, so therefore. All right. Just because you've isolated one cause doesn't mean you've gotten all the causes. Number eight, again, is a formal example, so don't worry about it. A couple more examples on the next slide, and then we're done. Number nine. So I cheated on my insurance. Big deal. The insurance companies charge high rates and they often don't pay claims. Well, you know what that is, right? Two wrongs. Number 10, everyone has the right to free speech. So although it is unpalatable to all of us, hate groups should have the right to air their views in public. As you know, in Canada, hate speech is illegal, right? So that's not true. Yes, Canadians are guaranteed free speech in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that does not entitle them to use hate speech, right? So therefore, although it is generally true that we have the right to free speech, it is not universally true, okay? And finally, number 11, I've invested heavily in the stock market, and my family is depending on high returns, so I know I will have high returns. It can't be otherwise. Believe me, I've invested in the stock market, and it doesn't work that way. Okay, that of course is wishful thinking. Okay, so I think that's good for this week. You've got plenty to work on. I will, post some suggested exercises probably tomorrow, maybe later tonight. I'll see if I have time, and then work on those in your labs, or if you want, work them on them on your own. And then I will post the assignment next Thursday, and it will involve all of the fallacies that we just talked about in today's lecture. Okay, so you have an excellent week, and I will see you online next week.